The following is an unrehearsed interview with Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley. Participating in today's public affairs program are Nathan Cones at Carroll Broadcasting and Shane Vander Hart at the Iowa Torch. Shane, you can start us off with a question for Senator Grassley.
Yes. What are your concerns about the Democrats' proposed voting rights legislation?
Well, if you read I think it's a 700-page bill. If you read those 700 pages, there's a lot of things in it. I gave you a long list of things that are bad about it, and I should do that before I quit answering your question. But from the start, the Constitution is pretty clear in Article 1 that state legislatures should consider, I think the words are manners of election. But you can go to the Constitution and read that part of it, get the exact language. And then that's what we've been doing for 240 years. We amend the Constitution so that you can't be discriminated on basis of color for voting. We did it for women in the 19th Amendment. We did it for 18 years old in another constitutional amendment. And then we have voting for president and congressman the same date, and that's by law. And then we have the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. But except for that, how you hold these elections for 240 years have been done by state legislatures. So why would you want a federal law that where 240 years has been working well for the country? And then another thing to consider, since some states have some irregularities and fraud, I like to use Chicago as an example. So they operate under Illinois law. If you had one federal law and you had that sort of fraud and irregularities, it would dilute the value of an Iowa vote, where now that dilution is restricted entirely to diluting the vote of anybody voting in Illinois. So those are two reasons that are at the 50,000-foot level. Now, just to give you two or three examples of what's bad about it within the legislation, the people of this country overwhelmingly support ID. In other words, various states have different ways of voter ID. And even among minority groups, voter ID is supported. It would do away with it. And then it would put federal dollars into campaigns. And even out of those federal dollars, a candidate could pay themselves a salary while they're running for office. And then there's a presidential slush fund to promote democracy. What's that all about? Those are three things. Okay, let's go to Nathan at Carroll Broadcasting.
Hey, thank you, Senator Grassley. Appreciate you having me on. Supply chain and workforce issues continue to be a problem for businesses, at least in my listening area and really nationwide. Why have these problems continued to persist, even despite all of the federal efforts to try and alleviate some of those problems? And then what do you see as a solution, at least from your perspective?
Okay. I would say supply problems, but not greater than the excess appropriations that the Democrats have spent this year, plus what they want to spend the rest of this year, but it looks like they are not going to get that additional $4.5 trillion spent, are the two main reasons for the inflation that we have that is at a 40-year high. Now, I don't know to what extent it's based upon backups at our ports, but that's a major significant part of it. And I don't know whether that's the main reasons we have supply problems or we have it even because of domestic production and domestic transportation. But in regard to what goes on at the ports, I don't think the president has 24/7, 365 operation at the ports as he said he was going to have, even though there's been agreement that the unions ought to work with him in accomplishment. And then beyond that, I think that the restrictions on truck traffic within California is very much an impediment, and not having such restrictions on warehousing in California is a major problem. And since a lot of this stuff, particularly from Asia, comes into those ports, that's a major problem. When this started being considered a problem, there were only 70 ships backed up. Now it's 100, as an example. So there hasn't been a lot of progress made in that area. And it also affects exports from the United States, because people in Asia are paying so much for containers that the containers are going back to Asia empty. So those are two or three things that are major problems. And also, I hear about these issues that you ask about at my county meetings, and I kicked off on Monday for the 42nd year in a row my holding a Q&A with constituents in every county to keep in touch with Iowans at the grassroots. Shane, again?
Yeah, just to continue on with talk about voting types of legislation anyway. There's been discussion about reforming the Electoral Count Act, at least making it to where it's because that law is kind of convoluted when it was passed in 1878, making clear at least that the vice president can't reject electors. Is that something you would support?
I think that there needs to be some changes to the 1886 law. I haven't seen any suggestions on how it ought to be changed yet, although there are people in the Congress working on that very point, and I think it would get broad bipartisan support. Now, whether I would vote for it, I'd want to read the legislation first. But remember, one thing, when you hear about the 2020 election and that the Democrats say that we need federalize the national voting laws, do away with the states. They're complaining because there was questions raised by Republican senators about maybe the election being stolen from Trump. You never hear about the last 3 times a Republican was elected, the Democrats did exactly the same thing. And it just irritates me that we don't hear the press talking about that. And that's not a criticism of you local people, but it seems like the New York Times and CNN and Washington Post have forgotten about those things. Let's see, that was Shane. So now Nathan.
Hey, Senator. One of your potential challengers in the midterms, Abby Finkenauer, pledged earlier this week to self-term limit herself. So assuming you're reelected at the midterms, term limits is something that you've floated as a possible idea. Any plans to potentially try and introduce something and get something in place, at least at the federal level, for elected officials?
Well, there's several things. I don't usually like to comment on a Democrat primary candidate because I don't know whether she'll even be my candidate or opponent. But she did say 2 years ago when she was running for Congress, when she was first elected to Congress, she took a position that she was against term limitations. Now, why is she changing? That'd be interesting to know. You'll have to ask her because I'm not going to ask her. Another thing that you need to remember is that every 6 years for me, 4 years for a governor, 2 years for a congressman, there is a chance to term limit people by voting them out of office. So that's everybody gets a chance at the ballot box to determine whether or not they want people reelected or not, or term limited. In my case, I've had overwhelming support from the electorate, and so that's that's why I've been in Congress a long time. The other thing is that I have voted for term limits 2 or 3 times. Now you'll have to go back in the history of those issues to get the exact dates that they were done, but I voted for it because I believed in it. But this self-determination, look I get to be chairman of the Finance Committee 6 years, chairman of the Judiciary so far another 4 years, and I have 4 years in that. I've still got 2 more years to be chairman of that. And I got an opportunity to be chairman of the Budget Committee for another 6 years if I run out of chairmanships of the other. By the way, Republicans do term limit their people to be chairman of committees. The Democrats don't do that. But what I'm telling you is my chairmanships and being the most senior member of the United States Senate is and that would be if I'm reelected, because right now Leahy beats me on that. But anyway, these are all to the benefit of Iowans, and I hope that people remember that. So when you just voluntarily term limit yourself to 2 terms, you're not going to build up the seniority to do great things for your state. Back to Shane, I believe.
Yeah, I want to talk about the filibuster. Democrats are obviously, Senate Democrats, Chuck Schumer in particular, talking about eliminating the filibuster specifically for the voting rights legislation we've discussed. If they accomplish this, would Republicans, when they're in the majority, do you believe, in return, eliminate it for legislation that they support, just similar to what we saw with judicial nominations when the Democrats eliminated judicial nominations, but not Supreme Court justices?
Well, that's the point I tried to make in debate yesterday with Merkley, that I tried to remind them of 2013. Every Republican voted against their effort to pack the D.C. Circuit Court, and they couldn't get 60 votes to do it. So they said, we're going to do it for lower court judges because you shouldn't be filibustering them. And we've always agreed that judges shouldn't be filibustered, but Democrats started filibustering our judges in 2003, I think. Never in the 200 years before that, judges weren't filibustered until they got mad at Bush, didn't want some of his Hispanic people to be on the D.C. Circuit, so they filibustered it, and people that was filibustered 7 times, I forget the guy's name, but they weren't going to let him on the D.C. Circuit because Bush couldn't get the chance of having the first Hispanic on the Supreme Court, because they go from that court to the Supreme Court most of the time. I guess his name was Estrada, if you want to look up the history of that. Anyway, we said, you're going to regret the day you do this, because you're leaving the Supreme Court justice still requiring 60 votes. So when we got the majority and a Republican president, we reminded them. When they howled because we were going to change it for the Supreme Court, we told you have a slippery slope. Well, that's exactly what we're telling the people right now. You want to do this just for a voting law. You can't expect a rule to apply to one side, but not the other. And you're going to be in the minority sometime, and you're going to regret it. So the last question is Nathan.
Yeah, Senator, thanks. I know it's not something that you had a hand in crafting at all, but was interested in your thoughts and comments on the proposed changes to Iowa's income tax to the flat 4%, as well as basically a full repeal, at least proposed anyway at this point, of retirement income tax. Just your responses and thoughts on that.
Let me give you a generic answer to that, because I don't like to comment on things that go on in the state legislature because I can't keep on top of it. But I do know what you're talking about, so I'm not ignorant about what you're talking about. But I think that to encourage savings, I've been in the middle of that. The most recent law, I was chairman of the committee when we got that passed. And it beefed up in savings, particularly for small business to have savings for their employees and things like that. And by the way, if you want to look it up, it's called the Secure Act, and that's an acronym that I don't remember the words for. But anyway, so the extent to which Iowa is trying to encourage more savings, but particularly keeping Iowans for not moving to Florida, or South Dakota to avoid paying the Iowa income tax, keeping that wealth in Iowa, I think is a smart thing to do. Okay, thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you, Nathan and Shane, for participating in today's Public Affairs program. This has been Senator Chuck Grassley reporting to the people of Iowa.